Great, well, welcome. Just so you know, this is being recorded, so you will be able to see it later if all works well. So I'm Lyn Price. I'm excited to be here today. This is one of my favorite talks to give. And people ask me, how did I get interested in the 1918 flu? And if you step back a little bit, I'm a statistician. I work at Tufts Medical Center, so I like the medical side. And then I recently got a history degree, and I used 17th century medical recipe cookbook for my thesis. And so that just really, and I'm a genealogist as well, a historian, and I just love social history. So like what was going on during a time period. I care more about the people like you and me than the big famous people that have been studied a lot. And so a couple of years ago, one of my friends just said, hey, here's my friend so-and-so, and she just gave a talk about the 1918 flu. I was like, oh, the 100-year anniversary is coming up, because this was a couple of years ago. And so I decided to put it together, and very quickly, I decided that I didn't want to talk a whole lot about the flu itself, as I wanted to talk about the impact on people and the stories that I've collected. So I will give you a little bit of a background about the flu just to set the stage, but then we will move right into the stories that I've collected that talk about the personal impact. And I do have a website that I just started like 3 weeks ago called 1918flustories.com, and that has some information. You're welcome to send me information you want to be added. If you have family stories, I am putting one story up a week. I already have 50 or 60 stories, so it'll take a while, but I am still collecting stories. So you can either come up and get a card afterwards with an email on it, or you can try the contact form, which I hope works on my website. I've gotten a few people that have used the form. So let's jump into it. So you might remember last year that it was a really bad flu season, the 2017-2018. Did anyone get the flu last year? Was it the worst you've ever had?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I hear.
I had the shot.
And you had the shot. The vaccine doesn't always work. It's supposed to make it better, but anyway, you should still get your shot. But it was really bad last year. And there were a lot of stories like this where a mom dies from the flu after the hospital sends her home. New Hampshire, a woman dies 2 days after being sent home from the hospital, after coming down from the flu, and they died in the hospital of sepsis and overreactive immune systems, basically. And this one, Tragic Faces, talks about a lot of the different people who died in 2017, 2018. Most of them were young being like 20 to 40, so not babies. And then the last one is coming up to 4,000 Americans a week. So the CDC came out in October of 2018, talking about that this was the worst flu season they've ever had on record since they started collecting information in the 1970s. So there were 80,000 people who died last year of flu and flu-related complications. 80,000 last year.
In this country? Or
in this country.
Worldwide?
In this country.
Wow.
And usually there's between 12 to 56,000 per year since they started keeping records. So 80,000 is a lot of people, right? Especially that we have antibiotics, we have Tamiflu, we have the vaccine, we have hospitals, ventilation support. Most of the people who die from pneumonia and secondary infections that come in, not exactly from the flu itself. The flu is really sneaky in that it is really good at opening up your body and your immune system to not recognizing secondary infections that come in, so you're much more susceptible to them. And this is the flu all the time, not just in 1918. Okay, so flu 101, in most years, not 1918, but last year, and most years, there's an incubation period of 24 to 72 hours, so 1 to 3 days, meaning during that time, you are contagious, but you don't have symptoms, so you don't know yet that you have it. And so you can be spreading it to all your friends and family without knowing that you're sick. Usually if you get sick, you have complete recovery within 10 days. I think most people have complete recovery much sooner than that. And of those that get the flu, 0.1% will die. Again, this is on average in the US every year, meaning 1 out of every 1,000 people who get the flu will die. So around 12 to 49 to 56,000 die each year from the flu and its complications. 1918, completely different story. There were 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. We don't know how many for a lot of reasons. One, the war was going on, right? So World War I was going on. World War I ended in November of 1918. The worst part of the flu was September, October, November 1918. So it ended, the war ended right during, just after the cusp of the epidemic, at least on the East Coast in the US. And so countries were not wanting, and especially army leaders were not wanting to say how many of their men had died. So there's someone that I gave a talk that actually says it's deliberately lowballed the number of deaths the Army did. There were a lot of places where the entire community was wiped out, and so who was there to keep records about how many people there were, how many people died? And this went everywhere. I know that my mom, when I first started researching this, I was talking to my mom who grew up in this little teeny tiny town in New Mexico. And she's like, it never came to Verdun. Well, her dad had helped put together a book of the history of Verdun, and I just randomly opened it up. Just happened to fly on the page that talked about the flu being in Verdun, and this woman who had spent a lot of time going back and forth treating everyone who had been sick. And then there were just a lot of places that didn't keep records. So we'll never know. So best estimates now are 50 to 100 million. Every time a new estimate is released, it goes up. It used to be 25 million. In the US was less hard hit than many of the other places. And the deaths here were about 675,000, which if you equate it to the population today, it would be almost 2 million. So 80,000 last year was a lot, but it doesn't rank anywhere near 2 million. Most of those occurred in the summer and fall of 1918, and about half of those from mid-September to early December. So about half of all of the 50 to 100 million deaths occurred in this 3-month period. And the death rate was 2.5%. So remember, in most years it's 0.1%, 1 in 1,000 people that get the flu will die. Here, 25 in 1,000 people who got the flu would die. And some of the deaths were pretty horrific. This was also very contagious, much more contagious than most flus. They estimate that a third of the population in 1918 was infected, that they got the flu. Way more than we'll get it today. So when you think of just so many more people getting the flu and then having a higher death rate, that's what leads to these really high death totals. One of the things that was really striking is half of the deaths were from people 20 to 40 years old. So usually during the flu, we see something like the dotted line here. So on the x-axis is age, on the y-axis is the death rate. So you can see with using the dotted line that most people that are gonna die, if they're gonna die from the flu, it's the very young, the toddlers, the infants, or the very old. But in 1918, the solid line is still, those groups still were affected, but there was this huge ramp up, enough that the overall life expectancy dropped by about 10 years, which is huge. And so this was up to 10% of all young adults at the time that were affected and may have died. And what it did is it just targeted healthy immune systems. For whatever reason, this specific form of the virus was just very good at targeting healthy systems, making them overreact, which then caused death because the immune system just overreacted so strongly, it basically killed the person. So symptoms. And think back to the other symptoms, extremely high fever and chills. Doctors thought this might be malaria. Coughing up blood, nosebleeds, bleeding from the ears. People thought this might, not just people, doctors thought this would be some sort of hemorrhagic disease. Severe pounding headaches and body aches so intense they felt their bones were breaking. Dengue fever is what the doctors thought. And then GI symptoms, some of which were pretty severe, cholera. So doctors didn't even know at first that this was one disease, this was the flu. And all of these symptoms were coming from the flu. And most people that got the flu in 1918 had just the normal version like you and I have. Maybe like that woman back there had, where it was the worst she's ever had, but she was still okay. But there were some people that just got hit horribly where they could die in some cases within a few hours from when they first had symptoms. So, and this is from Roy Grist. This is at Camp Devens, which if you haven't been there, it's about 45 minutes west of here, I think. Yeah, on Route 2. I'm not trying to remember, 30, maybe an hour from here, okay. And they have a museum there, so you can actually, they have a little bit about the flu, and there's a lot about the history of the camp, which was started in World War I. So Woodrow Wilson, the president, had run on the campaign to be reelected, that I kept you out of war. In 1916, he was reelected on that campaign. In 1917, he decided, well, you know what, we need to go to war. And now that we're gonna go to war, we're all gonna go to war, and you all and I am going to be 100% in, and all we're gonna do is the war effort. And so I'm not gonna talk a lot, just due to time, about the influence of the war, but John Barry, in his book, The Great Flu Epidemic, I think it's on my website. That might not be exactly the right term, but John Barry's the author. He talks a lot about the impact of World War I on the flu. So this is what he says happens to the soldiers. This is a doctor at Camp Devens. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe, or the grippe, these were all names for flu, or influenza. And when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly developed the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. And of the people that died, it really was this type of pneumonia that killed most of them. 2 hours after admission, they have mahogany spots over the cheekbones. And a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis, which is the darkening of the skin due to a lack of oxygen, extending from their ears and spreading all over their face. There's only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. Pneumonia means in about all cases, death. So there was a slide that I don't have here that I normally have that talks about why I chose to have stories. So Laura Spenny wrote a book called Paralyzing, which again tells about the 1918 flu. And a lot of the historians that have written these books are like, well, why was it forgotten? You know, this killed way more people than died in World War I, World War II, and maybe all of the wars of the 20th century combined. Why don't people talk about it? And there's a lot of different reasons they've come up with. One is, you know, when you go to war, there's a government behind you. A government can build the monuments. Also, the people, so this again was going on after this horrific war. They thought they would never have a war like this again because World War I was so horrific. When it was over in November of 1918, people just wanted to move on. They weren't going to commemorate the war. They were not going to commemorate this flu that had killed so many people. They were just ready to move on and be happier, have more hope for the future. And so Laura Spenny writes, I can't remember exactly, but something about that we'll remember the 1918 flu through a million discrete private tragedies. And so we'll remember it not because of government monuments or because of a lot of historical work has been done, although there has been since 1990, but up until then it was pretty much forgotten. But the way I interpret that is we'll remember it through the stories, so through family stories, which is why I collect family stories. So we'll get started. And so these stories that I've collected really talk about some of the different impacts of the war. So one of the things that happened if you got the flu in 1918, if you survived, is you were more susceptible to other diseases. Immediately, you were more susceptible to pneumonia, and often that would kill you. But this is Linda. She is a genealogist, and for years and years, she searched for the death record of Hattie Mae Lane. And because half of her family said she died from tuberculosis, the other half said she died from pneumonia, and she wanted to know, what did she really die from? And she finally found the death certificate, and it said the cause of death was tuberculosis pulmonosus, or pulmonary tuberculosis, following the Spanish influenza about 1 year ago. So she died in November of 1919. She had the flu in October, November of 1918. Did she have the flu before she had tuberculosis? I don't know. Linda doesn't know. But if she didn't have tuberculosis before, then the flu certainly would have opened it up, her lungs, for it to come in. If she did have the tuberculosis before she got the flu, then it would have made her very weak and kind of hastened the course of tuberculosis. And then there were other long-term health consequences. Robin Mason said, my grandmother said her hair turned white after she recovered from the flu. She was 28 years old. Are there any guesses as to why the flu would make someone's hair turn white?
Stress that the body was under trying to recover from?
Could be. And actually, I have to say I don't know the answer, so I'm not looking for a right answer because I don't know. So she said stress that the body was under. My best guess is that I know that the really high fevers made hair fall out. Like, fevers were so high that people lost their hair. I'm wondering if that might make your hair turn white. I just gave this talk earlier this week, and someone said maybe oxygen starvation, because one of the things with the people who had the severe course is that when your body is overreacting and your immune system is overreacting in the lungs, it fills your lungs with fluid. So a lot of the people died from either from lack of oxygen in various ways or from drowning from the fluid in their lungs. So he's like, maybe the oxygen starvation, I don't know, possibilities. And then this is one of my family stories. So when I started this 2 years ago, I didn't think I had any family stories. I asked my mom, and she's like, well, no, it never came to Verdon. We don't have family stories. I asked my dad, and he said no. But it turns out that the woman mentioned the second one that lost her hearing is my great-grandmother. And my father was very, very close to her when he was growing up. She'd always had loss of hearing, but he just thought that all grandmas or many grandmas had loss of hearing. So he didn't ever, I'm sorry, I didn't mean all, many, some. To a kid, yeah, to a kid. So he didn't really think about it. And he didn't even know about the story until I was going through some of his family papers. And I was like, Dad, did you know this? And he said no. So this was written by her daughter. So the name of my great-grandmother is Effie. So during the flu epidemic of World War I, Mother had the dreadful disease, which left her with the loss of most of her hearing. This was a real trial to her all her life. But she tried to be cheerful and not dwell on her infirmities. And she was about 20 years old when she got the flu. And so she dealt with hearing loss all of her life. And actually, hearing loss, something to do with the eyes, were very common. Some of them were only temporary. Some of them did last the rest of your life. One of the other things that kind of came out of that is a Parkinson-like disease that many in the 20s, a lot of people had this disease, and they thought that maybe it was tied back to the flu, but they don't know for sure. And when you had the flu, and shortly after, there were also dementia symptoms. Not dementia, but cognitive impairment symptoms, so most of which went away, but I don't know that they all did. And so the next few come from the PBS American Experience website. And so they have a website about the 1918 flu. They have a documentary. It's really fabulous. And so I would go check it out. And what they did for part of that, so 1990s is when, for whatever reason, all of a sudden people started realizing, hey, there's this thing called the 1918 flu. Maybe we should check it out. And so there started being a lot of historical research. PBS is one of the first ones. And so these next 3 slides are where they interviewed people who were children at the time, because that's who was still alive in 1990, were people who were kids in 1918. And so Susanna said, the fear in the hearts of the people just withered with them. They were afraid to go out, afraid to do anything. You just lived from day to day, did what you had to do, and not think about the future. So if you think about it, try to picture yourself as a kid or as a parent. There is this super contagious disease going around. You don't know what causes it because you can't, scientists yet don't have microscopes that are strong enough to see a virus. Some of them thought it was caused by bacteria. Some of them thought there might be something called a virus, but they didn't know what it was because they couldn't see it. So there were no treatments for this because no one knew what it was. And so schools are being closed. Churches are being closed. And your friends, you can't play with your friends if you're a kid. You're afraid to let your kids go play with their friends if you're a parent. Like, life really did, in some ways, just shut down. People did still have to go to work, but here in Boston, in an effort to try to keep less people on the T, they actually mandated, it didn't work, but they tried to make businesses operate at different hours and stagger the opening and closing time of businesses so that there wasn't really a rush hour. Like, there was just so many ways that your life was impacted. And Dan said we were almost afraid to breathe. The theaters were closed down, so you couldn't get into any crowds. The one thing they did know is that it was easily spread through crowds. So they didn't want crowds. You couldn't play with your playmates. You just had to stay home and be careful. Think if you're a 5 or 6-year-old kid, you don't understand why you can't play with your friends. And here in Boston, they finally closed the schools, probably later than they should have. They closed saloons, they closed theaters. They did not close churches, but they strongly encouraged that the churches themselves chose not to have services. But again, think about it. There's this horrible thing going around. You're religious. This is where you find like your peace is with your people, and now you can't go to church. There was really no place you could go, I guess. It was just a hard time. And then William said, it took away all your community life. You had no school life. You had no church life. You had nothing. You were surrounded by death. When each day dawned, you didn't know whether you would be there when the sun set that day. One of the stories that I just found this week, so it's not in my slides, is one of my friends at work who is probably in her 80s. She keeps retiring and then unretiring because she gets bored. But she was telling me about her mother. Her mother was 15 when she got sick with the flu, and she was raised by her father and her grandmother. Her grandmother had died the year before or something else. So her father, who was this lawyer in New York City, stayed by her bedside until she got better. When the schools reopened, she went back to school. She and her friends would say, hey, where's Sally? She died. Where's Robbie? He died. Where's Megan? She died. And then they stopped asking.
Wow.
Can you imagine that too many of their friends had died? Wow. And this is from someone in the Appalachians somewhere. I forget exactly where. And I wrote it. So she was 5 years old. Her name is Ida. She was 5 years old when she got the flu. And then she wrote about it years later, and so this is her history. Then came the war of 1918 that took a lot of young boys. And then come the flu that killed so many people. The flu broke out, and people was dying like flies, and no one was able to bury them for days. My mother and me, Ida Stevens, took the flu and almost died. No one thought we would make it. We were so bad. We lived on the knoll overlooking Lawton, and we could overlook the place and see caskets set a long time before anyone could come. So think of the public health issues and this was out in the country, so it probably wasn't so bad there. And again, remember, this is hemorrhagic disease as well. So in Philadelphia, Boston says it wasn't the case, but I don't think I believe them. I'm gonna look more into that. The morgues and the cemeteries could not keep up with the amount of deaths. And so your morgues were stacked floor to ceiling with bodies. We ran out of caskets. There was no way, we ran out of people that could bury them. Like became a huge public health problem, especially in Philadelphia. And I was reading somewhere, I don't think it's part of this talk, but it's part of some of my other talks, where someone in Danbury, Connecticut, or Waterbury, Connecticut, was talking about the end of October, 500 people had died in his city in the month of October. And on October 26th, he wrote all of the churches were closed, and there were 50 people who were digging graves in the cemetery. And even at the end of the day, with 50 people digging graves, and not just digging individual graves, but digging a big trench grave, there were still 9 adults and 2 infants that were not buried. The next day, the government sent out a call for 100 more people to come and help dig the graves. So in any city, this was a big problem in terms of bodies were just stacking up, and you didn't have enough people to bury them. And then military life. So we talked a little bit about Camp Devens. So in terms of the flu in the US, Boston was the hardest hit city, one of the hardest hit cities. It was certainly the first hit city, which is why it was one of the hardest hit cities, is it had no time to prepare because it didn't know what was coming. Philadelphia, which was harder hit, did have time, and it didn't. One of the things with the war is Liberty loans, and like those were really ways that they funded the war. And everyone was supposed to support them, and they had these huge rallies and parades, and Philadelphia knew that they had the flu in town. They saw what was happening in Boston, with just everything shutting down and hundreds of people dying every day. And the city leaders decided not to cancel the parade. Oh, so hundreds of thousands of people came to the parade in Philadelphia at the end of September, and then within 2 or 3 days, the hospitals were filled. So there was just a lot of that. But one of the places that was really hard hit was Camp Devens. So it started in the Navy Yard. It moved into the civilian population, but in between the Navy Yard and civilian population, it moved to Camp Devens. And remember, soldiers were being transported all over the place. You didn't know you were sick until up to 3 days after you were able to spread the disease. And so this is Floyd West. He was a medical tech at Camp Devens. And his grandson writes about what he did, and then he says, some soldiers in World War I saw hell on a battlefield. Others, such as my grandfather, saw another sort of hell in hospital wards full of comrades racked with the Spanish influenza. So there were just hundreds of men that were sick. They were coughing up blood, they were coughing, they were turning blue, they were having all of these horrible symptoms, and he had to take care of them. You can imagine how that must have affected him mentally, physically. Am I gonna get it? And just seeing these people suffering, trying to breathe because their lungs were so filled with fluid, they were having trouble breathing. He actually at some point did get the flu because he was discharged in April of 1919 because his lungs, because of the flu, he survived, but his lungs were so damaged he couldn't perform his duties. And then this is where a ship sinks due to the flu. So this is Clyde Pendleton. He was a gunner on the USS America, which was a transport ship, which brought people back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, brought troops and supplies. And so he did get the flu at some point, but it was when he was on land. So it wasn't during the incident I'm gonna be talking about. So anyway, they came to Boston in early September to pick up a bunch of troops to take them over to Europe. Really bad time to be taking people over. Woodrow Wilson knew that, but he had to make the decision about winning the war and having more bodies in Europe versus putting people on troop ships where he knew some of them would die. It was a tough decision for him, but in the end, he's like, we need to send the troops over. So there were 1,000 people who got sick on the voyage over. About 50 of them died. And when it came back to New Jersey, they decided maybe they needed to fumigate it. And so when you fumigate a ship, it's probably pretty caustic smelling, right? We don't know what they use, but I would imagine they wanted to air it out. And so they opened a lot of the windows and doors, including ones on the lower part of the ship. I think, that when the ship, when the tide came in, the ship would rise and it wouldn't matter because it wouldn't, I think. In any case, either it got stuck in the mud and therefore tilted to one side and water rushed in, or just they'd open doors that were too low down. it ended up sinking. So there were about 6 men who died because they couldn't get off. Most of the people who died got off. I mean, most of the people who were on the ship got off, but there were 6 who died. So there were other ways that you could die, not exactly from the flu. And the nurses were really important. I mentioned that they didn't know what they were fighting, right? So there's not a lot the doctors could do. There weren't treatments that they had. So if you were sick, or if your kid was sick, what would you want? What would you need or your kid need to get better? If there wasn't Tamiflu, there wasn't antibiotics. Nursing care. And what does nursing care give you? Like, what do nurses do?
They could step in for other family members and provide support that you might not be able to.
In terms of what type of support?
Oh, everything. And care, feeding,
Yes,
bathing,
exactly.
close proximity stuff.
Yes. So, I'm sorry?
Trying to keep you cool.
Trying to keep you cool. Yeah.
Cool.
Yes, exactly. So nurses, so for people who got this disease, it took a really long time for them to recover, if they were going to recover. And they needed rest, or else they weren't going to recover. If they started working or doing whatever, taking care of the family too soon, they would relapse and perhaps die. And so nurses were so important because they were able to come in and give the family and the sick person the rest that they needed, give them food, clean their house, whatever they were going to do. In fact, there's at least one case in John Barry's book where a nurse was kidnapped because the family was so desperate to have help that they kidnapped a nurse and forced her to care for their family members. So this is Miss Frances Poole. She was a Red Cross nurse, meaning she wasn't trained. The first week or so, they really wanted trained nurses, and then when they realized how bad it was, they're like, we need anybody who can provide support. And so when they closed the schools in Boston, they asked the school teachers to be nurses as well. So with the Red Cross, that means she wasn't trained. And she was from Evanston near Chicago. She was very wealthy. And so she certainly wasn't doing this for the money. She was doing it out of the goodness of her heart. And she died, and so the call for nurses went out in September. She died before October 11th, 1918, in New York. And one of her colleagues wrote, during the terrible epidemic, which was very severe in Camp Ontario, Miss Poole did not spare herself, and though she had a severe cold and was urged not to go on duty, she saw the extreme need of the boys and like a brave soldier fought the fight until she fell, a victim of pneumonia. This is another nurse. This one, she was in an Army Nurse Corps, meaning she was a trained nurse. And she enlisted as a nurse September 30th. She was dead 2 weeks later of pneumonia. And she's listed on the memorial in her hometown. Doctors, even though they couldn't do a lot, they wanted to do what they could. And so they tried to, Helga writes, my great-grandfather, Dr. Samuel Chandler Baker, went to New York to help those who had contracted influenza, and he caught it and passed away from it. And then I have no context for this. This just comes out of one sentence in John Barry's book, that on September 17th, 5 doctors and 14 nurses at a civilian hospital in Philadelphia collapsed. They had exhibited no prior symptoms. I don't know what happened to them, because again, it's one sentence in his book, but all of a sudden, this hospital lost 19 people that could care for people. Whether they died or not, they were out of commission until they were better. And they had no symptoms. I mean, this wasn't super common, but it wasn't super uncommon either. And then in JAMA, it's the Journal of the American Medical Association. They have they have issues that come out weekly. And so they, in the back, they have obituaries, and usually it's just, like a little bit, because they're little obituaries, they're not big obituaries. Here there were 3 pages of obituaries of doctors who had died in the past week, both in the US and then in army camps abroad. And most of them from either influenza or the flu. So a lot of the doctors were dying as well. On the other hand, some opportunities were opened. This is Marion. She was married to Robert in December of 1913. I don't know, in December, in 1913. And so they had 5 years together, and they had 3 children together, 3 sons. One of them had died previously of something else, but then I'm going to just read this newspaper article. It says, the death of Robert Dakin occurred at his home in Park Place Sunday morning after a 3-week illness of pneumonia following an attack of influenza, so he survived for 3 weeks. The death of Mr. Dakin was the 3rd to occur in his family within a week. On Monday, her mother died. She had come down to help take care of the children once Robert got sick. Her mother died, and then her son died, and then her husband died. So within a week, she had lost 3 family members. What was she going to do? What do you do if you're a woman back then? I'm sorry? Get married again. Yes. She was luckier than most in that she'd already had some education in nutrition. And so she took her father, who'd also lost his wife and his son-in-law and his grandson. She took her remaining son and her father to Chicago. And they lived with her sister, who was in Chicago, while she finished her education. Then she came back to what would become the University of Connecticut, and she was the nutritionist. She was the extension nutritionist. She had a fabulous career. I've seen some of the things that she wrote as part of her job. You know, she would write things about how to plant, how to preserve, how to make healthy meals, anything with nutrition. But at what cost? Do you think that if she could have kept her husband and her mom and her kid that she would have? For sure. And her granddaughter agrees. So even though opportunities were opened, they usually came at a great cost. There was an immeasurable impact on orphans. We don't know a lot about what happened with orphans because there was no safety net. You know, the ones that were lucky went to live with family, and then the others might have ended up on the street. This one was, quote, lucky in that he ended with family, but it didn't sound like a very nice life. It says, so Noreen writes, my grandfather died after only a 6-day illness. My father was only 6 and got parceled out to an aunt and uncle. He was always the extra and felt very much a burden. I'd say the impact was immeasurable on my father's life. And often what happened is, so I don't know if the grandmother had died, you know, if the kid's mom had died earlier, or if she just wasn't able to take care of him. It's very common in the stories that I've come across that no matter which spouse died, the other one generally didn't keep the kid. Generally the kid, in the stories that I have, were farmed out to family members. And even when the spouse remarried, the kids usually didn't come back. They usually, for whatever. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But so it really broke up families as well. And then, of course, lives were changed forever. This is Waldo. He died in December of 1918, leaving his wife Lena and 3 young children. Lena's brother Stanley was in 8th grade. He was 14 or 15, and he dropped out of school to help his sister and be the man of the house. He took over Waldo's job in a leather factory, and even though his sister eventually remarried, again, the kids had been farmed out, they didn't come back. She was not close with her kids from what I could tell. But it totally impacted his life because he was not able to go back and finish his education, so he had to work hard labor the rest of his life. Whereas if he'd stayed in school, perhaps he wouldn't have had to do that. But then it wasn't all drudgery. So this is a soldier, Bill Matthews, and there were 2 cases. So I went through some of the letters that he wrote home, and there were only 2 cases that even kind of referenced the flu. So one day he wrote, I was sick of bed with a very high fever Saturday afternoon. I went to bed at 3 p.m. and took one of Doc's fever pills. Doc was one of their family friends, which broke it up. I got up at 5:30, and after that I went to bed again. That is, I called Father during the short time I was up, so he came down Sunday. So Bill didn't seem to be worried, but his father was like, maybe that's the flu, I should get down there. It wasn't, he was fine, but you can see his father's like, I need to get down and be with my son. And then so this is a US soldier, he never got, at least up to this point, he hadn't gone overseas. He was in New York and then Philadelphia. But you wouldn't know that there was anything going on because in Philadelphia and New York, he was like, I'm going on all these dates and we're doing this and there's these dances. So you would never actually know that there was the flu going on. At the end of November, or the end of October, he writes, we're quarantined to the little city of New York and mustn't leave it on account of the flu. I expect the quarantine to be raised this week, but if it isn't, I'm going to run a chance to go home. So the optimism of youth. And then this one just makes me laugh. So this is another US soldier. He was stationed in Paris. And in February 1919, he wrote, I had a touch of the flu, but I kept up all the time on sheer grit. And I think by keeping up and drilling with the boys, that I fooled them all to the extent that the hospital got cheated out of another patient. By gee whiz, they didn't get me. I told the boys that the germs can't kill me on foreign soil, for I'm going to croak in the good old USA. So if he had the flu, it certainly was just a touch. Otherwise, he would have been in the hospital as much as he wanted to cheat them out of a patient. He came home, married, had a good long life before he died. This was one, for the person who wanted a gruesome story, this is a little bit gruesome. So not all deaths were direct result of the flu. So Henry Wright Dunn lived in Alabama. He was a merchant, and he was pretty wealthy. And because he was in Alabama, he could see that the flu that had started on the East Coast was kind of marching west. And so he decided he wanted to get a nurse. Since he could afford it, He wasn't going to kidnap her. He paid for her. But he wanted a nurse to come just in case. So the flu hadn't even come yet. His family wasn't sick. But he had hired this nurse to be with them for the duration of whatever the duration was. Well, so on the day appointed, he went to get her. He drove across the railroad tracks, up the hill. His car stalled, came back down the hill right into an oncoming train. And so this is the car. You can see that it's pretty mangled. He did survive for 2 or 3 days, but was in incredible pain. And so it was not a happy death, and he was not sick with the flu. So there were other deaths that were related to the flu, but not of the flu. And then there were a lot that survived. So this is the story from one of my friends. She said, my great-grandfather's new bride died, and the doctors told his family he would die. His father and brother, with whom there had been a major falling out, had had a terrible crop year. My great-grandfather had had an excellent year. When they were told he was dying, they went and stole all his seed wheat. He didn't die, so that didn't go over so well. So she says the rift still exists to this day. She really wants to cross over to the other side and reconnect, but she's not sure how to do that. So the rift, I mean, there was already a rift before. There had been some major falling out before, but then I think it was sealed once they tried to seal him in because they thought he would die. And then my last story is, this is my great aunt, Cleo. So this is Verdun, New Mexico, again, where my mom said the flu never came. And she was 5 months old when she got it, and she wrote this when she was an adult. During the winter of 1918, there was a terrible flu epidemic that swept the entire country, and many people died from it. I was 5 months old when I got the flu and was very ill. Mama told me that for 3 days I lay in a stupor, but through faith and administration, I was spared. My father had the flu that same winter and was very ill with it. So her father's my great-grandfather. My grandfather wasn't born until about 5 years later. So I'm really glad that both Cleo and her father survived so that I could be here. So those are some of my stories that I've collected. I hope that they've helped share a little bit about the impact of the flu. And are there any questions?
Have they done any genetic research on the strain of the flu in that it seems so much more like a hemorrhagic fever than a traditional influenza? Have they been able to find samples that they can test to have a better understanding of the virus?
Yes, they have. So Gina Colada's book, go to my website and these books are all there. Gina Colada's book, and then anything by Jeffrey Tannenbaum. I don't have him listed on my website, but both of them talk about how, Gina Colada's book especially talks about how someone in the like a Swedish researcher or someone that was in the US in the 1940s had this theory that if he went to Alaska, people in the permafrost, that if he could find some bodies, he might get the sample. Ended up being a lot more complicated than that, but they did get the sample. They do have, they were able to genotype it or do whatever they do. I'm not a geneticist. And so they do know that it was H1N1, and they know some other stuff. It doesn't help them with the origin, though, because there's 3 different theories about where this flu started. One of them is in the US, one is in Europe, one is in China. And until they have to find bodies with DNA still in each of those places in order to see if it was the same strain. It's a long-winded question answer.
I see a slide or two that it was referred to as the Spanish flu.
Oh, yes. Yes, so let me tell you.
Was that the name of it for the, or was it just the 1918 flu epidemic?
I'm glad you brought that up because I always forget to say that. So they're the same thing. So the Spanish, it was called the Spanish flu because, again, this is where it ties in with World War I. Spain was neutral. It was one of the few countries that was neutral. And so it was one of the few countries where there wasn't censorship of the newspapers, and censorship would include talking about epidemics because that could give the enemy information and cause morale to drop. And so the newspapers in Spain could freely report it, whereas most other countries couldn't. And so even though it did not start in Spain, it was not the worst in Spain. People thought it originated in Spain because Spain was talking about it. So that's why it's called the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu, La Grippe. Some people call it the Great Plague. There's a lot of different names for it, but the Spanish flu is the same as the 1918 flu. Any other questions?
Sorry, nobody else. Statistically speaking, so if somebody got the flu, then they died of pneumonia, which did they die from the flu or did they die from pneumonia?
They died of pneumonia secondary to the flu. So
was it counted as?
It was counted as a flu death.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it wasn't to begin with, because to begin with, the flu was not a reportable disease in the US, meaning even though they usually would capture it on the death certificate, Like, there were things like measles that if you were a doctor and you saw a kid with measles, you'd have to report it like to the government. But you didn't have to do that with the flu in the US until about October of 1918. All of a sudden, it became mandated. But even then, people on the death certificates weren't always consistent. So some would say flu, some would say pneumonia, some would say flu secondary to pneumonia. Some of them were not captured, which is another reason those numbers will never be known, is a lot of them wouldn't have actually noted it as the flu for a variety of reasons. I'll come back to you. No, does anyone else have any questions? Okay, go ahead.
So was it bad timing that the flu struck at about the same time as the end of World War I, or was there a huge correlation? I missed.
Some people have argued that there's a correlation. Some people have said that Germany was ready to make this huge offense. It was kind of their last shot to win the war. And it was sometime in the summer, I think, that they were planning, spring or summer, but all of their troops were sick, and so they couldn't. And so because that offense failed, some people attribute that to them losing the war. And so that was due to the flu. Other people say that the German commander was just trying to make excuses. So I'm actually not a military historian, so I'm not sure, but it could have played a role. Okay, she's full of questions. We'll take one more question and then we can end.
No, it's probably gonna be it. I had so many questions I wanted to ask, but I'm lost train of thought on that.
Okay, well, I'll make a little spill if it comes back.
Okay.
So as I said, I feel it's really important to tell what Laura Spinney's called these million discrete private tragedies. I feel it's really important to get these stories out there, which is why I've created a website. So if you have family stories, it can be a sentence. It doesn't anything. I would love to hear it. Put it on my website. So I have cards up here. You can email me at bridginthepass@gmail.com or go to the website and fill out the contact form. So thank you very much. You remembered? Okay.